One day, a boy named Jake stood in front of an old and abandoned hospital. The windows of the hospital were shrouded in darkness, and its door was covered in rust. Jake stepped inside, curiosity taking over. The corridors were empty, and the footsteps echoed. Suddenly, in the distance, he heard a faint whisper, "Who's there?" Jake asked, but received no reply. As he wandered the corridors, he felt a slight trembling in the walls. His eyes briefly flashed with a red light, then returned to normal. Jake stopped in front of a room. The door was trembling slightly, and a sound akin to a faint smile emanated from inside. He approached the door and peered in. In the room, there was a shadowy figure lying on a bed shrouded in white. Jake asked, "Is anyone there?" But once again received no answer. Suddenly, the head of the shadowy figure turned, and it looked at Jake. Its eyes were dark and gleaming. Jake screamed and fled the room. As he ran down the corridor, he could hear the doors closing behind him. Finally, Jake stepped out of the hospital. Silence prevailed behind the door. The flickering light of the street lamps illuminated his fearful face. Jake took a deep breath, then hurried home. Since that day, Jake always remembered the image of that old hospital. He still didn't know what had happened, but that dark room and the shadowy figure were always on his mind. In the street, in the middle of an old, shadowy neighborhood, there was a house that everyone ignored. The walls of the building were crumbling, and its windows were shattered. People wouldn't even set foot there because, according to the neighborhood legend, this house was cursed. One night, four friends who claimed to be brave decided to explore this abandoned house. Under the dim light of the moon, they stood in front of the door. The door creaked open, as if the house was inviting them, and as they entered, dust covering old furnishings and silence greeted them. As they roamed the first floor, they suddenly heard a door creak open. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to go upstairs. As they ascended, the rooms were filled with peculiar surprises. Behind closed doors in one room, there was an old crib, and in another, mysterious symbols adorned the walls. Then they heard the swift footsteps of someone. Everyone froze. The sound was getting closer, and they could feel someone's breath on their necks. Together, they sought refuge in an abandoned room in the corridor. The room was empty, and they could see the darkened streets through its window. But there was something outside, lurking in the shadows, waiting. The friends held their breath, but nothing happened. The footsteps behind the door faded away, and silence returned. Finally, they mustered their courage and left the room. As they walked down the corridor, they followed the traces of the mysterious symbols. One room was different from the others. Its door was carefully closed. When they entered the room, they found an old journal on the floor. The pages of the journal were yellowed, and the writing was hard to read. Suddenly, the room trembled, and the door rattled. The friends turned around in fear, and a shadow appeared behind the door. Its eyes gleamed, and it whispered with a thin voice. The creak of the door echoed in their ears. The friends, remembering this moment, filled with fear, left the abandoned house. They stood in front of the door once again. The street was quiet, but they felt an oddity surrounding them. That night, they never passed through that street again. But the story of the abandoned house continued to live on, circulating through the town's gossip. A group of young friends went into the woods to spend the weekend in nature. The rustling of the trees and the howling of the wind broke the silence as the sun set. The forest grew darker. As they walked, a distant scream was heard. Everyone froze and looked at each other. Their eyes scanned surroundings, but they couldn't see anything. "Maybe it's just birds," one of them said. But there was still a lingering unease among them. They continued to walk cautiously. After a while, they came across an old, dilapidated house. Its door was rotting, and its windows were shattered. The vegetation around it seemed to almost engulf the entire structure. The group approached the house with curiosity. When they entered, they could sense a strange taste in the air. The interior of the house was filled with old belongings. A faint light seeped through the dusty curtained windows. Suddenly, they heard a strange sound. Everyone stopped and listened intently. The sound, like a creak, was heard again. It was clear that it was footsteps. They all moved forward quietly, heading towards the source of the sound. Behind a door, there was a peculiarly glowing light. They carefully opened the door. Inside was a strangely illuminated room. In the middle, there stood an old mirror. When one of the friends looked into the mirror, they suddenly saw their face deform. They recoiled in horror, but instead of their own face, another face appeared in the mirror. They looked around the room in panic, but the door had vanished.